I watched A Civil Action with John Travolta, and my overall impressions of the movie was, aside from the acting, it was a pretty accurate depiction of the justice system and the tort system, I would say, just because it's true. The main premise of the movie was that a small law firm was trying to represent a few families whose children had died, um, allegedly from chemicals in the water that they were drinking. It was in the city of Woolburn, and at first the lawyer didn't want to take the case, but then after he had realized who the case was against, it was against Grace and Beatrice Foods, which are big corporations such as Tropicana, Playtex, um, big money corporations basically. And um, throughout the whole movie, it kind of shows how the lawyers started to go bankrupt because their clients didn't pay until they either won or settled. And since it had been drawn out in court for a long time, there was a lot of fees to be paid and a lot of things that necessary that they needed to do to prove their case, such as have geologists look at the river flow and rock foundations. They needed a lot of scientists, geologists, expert witnesses to testify for this trial. And, to do all of that, it was very expensive. They also needed doctors who would testify for the children, how they had died. They had died of leukemia, and it was getting expensive. So the lawyers were potentially on the cusp of bankruptcy, trying to win this, basically what it seemed to be unwinnable case. Tort that was involved was a theory of negligence. And basically, how they broke that down was that the big corporations had a duty to keep everyone safe from their factories that they had used to produce their products. They breached that by dumping chemicals from these factories into river streams that eventually led to people in the area consuming that water, which the causation would be people started dying of leukemia because in the 60s and 70s they were dumping the chemicals from those big corporations into these rivers. Families weren't intent on securing any monetary damages. They were just mostly wanting an apology, and they wanted to make sure that they would clean up the rivers and that this wouldn't happen again. But in one of the corporations, it was Grace and Beatrice Foods. Grace had settled for $8 million with the law firm and the people. So the attorneys, their normal rate was 40%, but they were willing to give the families more, and that they would take 28%. Looked further into trying to figure out if the big corporations, who throughout the movie we learned that they hide chemical barrels and ditches and try to evade the government from realizing that they were dumping chemicals. I would look into a possible fraud case for that, and try to link it to strict liability with these companies. I do think that the main tort is negligence, which the small law firm did try to argue for. Representing the company, I would probably look into the unintentional, disbursement of the employees and figure out if the employees' conduct would be tied to the company's liability. So if they were, unauthorized. It also talks in the movie how when an employee would go on his break, he would see people dumping out fats and stuff. So potentially, the company could argue that the employees were dumping these vats, on their break time or on, their separate personal time. So technically, it may not be the company's responsibility for them to um, be liable for the conduct of their employees on said personal breaks. The act of vicarious liability, I think it kind of counterplays my previous statement about the employee's time, technically depending on their contracts, and if they were handling company product, then you could tie a link for vicarious liability with the employee, whether or not they were on their break or not, depending on the contract, like I said. I learned a lot from the movie. I think it was good to watch, especially for aspiring lawyers. I think it was a good eye opener, and it really kind of makes you take a step back and think about, aside from the money part, really trying to figure out if you're able to adequately fight for people and get them the justice that they deserve. I also think it's important that lawyers know when to quit, I guess. It's kind of the whole premise of the movie also is understanding, when enough is enough and you know that you're not going to win. However, you can reach out to other resources that might be able to, such as the attorney reached out to the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency with all of his documentation from the previous trial to try and go against Beatrice Foods. So the movie ended with the lawyer of Beatrice Foods, counsel for Beatrice Foods, getting served with the paperwork, and it says Environmental Protection Agency on that. So, I think that was really important to realize that if you don't have the right tools or the funds to represent your client, then it's important to try to get in touch with other people who can and who might be able to be successful at it. That was sad was the fact that the main attorney wasn't really interested in actually helping people. He was more interested in money, but he has a change of heart mid-movie. So, of Jerry, who was counsel for Beatrice Foods, I would consider him a person who thinks he knows it all because he's been in law for so long. Schindler, I think that was his name, the attorney for the families, who is the main guy that you kind of see. I think he's a realistic lawyer. A lot of people go in it for the money, but then they realize that it's about the families and it's about justice. The other characters in the movie, the families, I think they were mostly looking to seek justice for their children that passed away due to leukemia. It was based on a true story. Doesn't change my view of the justice system. It just makes me more responsive to tort reform. I think it's important that people realize how hard it is to fight for justice, and I think it's important that we start acknowledging that. That way, we can pave a way for changes in the near future.